The specific moment when your manifestation feels most broken is the moment when it is closest to working. This is not motivational language designed to comfort people who are struggling. This is a description of a precise neurological event that occurs inside every human brain during the final stage of a genuine financial transformation, and understanding it with biological accuracy rather than spiritual optimism is the difference between the people who push through to permanent wealth and the people who abandon the process at the exact moment when continuing would have changed everything. Your manifestation does not feel broken because it stopped working. It feels broken because the part of your neurology that is responsible for making it feel broken is fighting harder than it has ever fought before. These are not the same thing. The intensity of the feeling of failure is not proportional to how close you are to actual failure. It is proportional to how close you are to the old system losing permanent control over your financial identity. The harder the feeling hits, the closer the completion. The more convincingly your circumstances argue that nothing is working, the more neurological resources the old architecture is consuming in its final attempt to maintain dominance. A system that is winning does not fight this hard. Only a system that is losing fights this hard. To understand why your manifestation feels broken at this specific stage, you need to understand how the subconscious actually responds to the installation of a new financial baseline. Most people who study manifestation carry a model of the subconscious that is fundamentally incorrect, and this incorrect model makes the final resistance period not only painful, but genuinely uninterpretable. They imagine the subconscious as a neutral recording device that accepts new instructions and begins implementing them once the instructions are sufficiently clear and emotionally charged. Under this model, the feeling of breakdown is evidence of a flaw in the instruction, insufficient clarity or insufficient emotional intensity, and the correct response is to intensify the practice, to feel more, to visualize more vividly, to generate stronger conviction that the outcome is already real. This model produces the exact behavior that prevents the transformation from completing, because the subconscious is not a neutral recording device. It is a biological immune system with a single primary directive: preserve the existing configuration against intrusion. Every assumption you introduce that contradicts the existing financial baseline is processed by the subconscious not as a new instruction to be implemented, but as a threat to be neutralized. The more genuine and neurologically deep the new assumption becomes, the more aggressively the subconscious mobilizes its resources to neutralize it. The subconscious does not distinguish between threats that would harm you and threats that would benefit you. It identifies deviation from baseline, and it responds to deviation with maximum defensive force. This is why the feeling of breakdown arrives precisely when the assumption has become real enough to threaten the old architecture. A surface-level positive thinking exercise does not generate serious resistance because the subconscious does not classify it as a genuine threat. It is too shallow to challenge the existing architecture at any meaningful depth. But a genuine assumption, one that has been held with sufficient consistency and neurological sincerity to actually begin competing with the old financial architecture for dominance, that generates a full immune response. The subconscious recognizes that the new state has achieved real structural depth, and it responds by manufacturing the most convincing possible case for returning to the old state. It generates this case through your external circumstances, because your external circumstances are the most biologically authoritative channel available for updating your core predictive model. The manufactured case is extraordinarily convincing because it is physically real. The bills that arrive are real bills. The income that contracts generates real financial pressure with real consequences. The relationships that fracture involve real people responding in ways that produce real effects on your daily life. Your body generates real fatigue. Your rational mind generates real arguments, sophisticated and well-evidenced and logically coherent, all pointing toward the same conclusion. The manifestation is not working. The assumption was wrong, and the only intelligent response is to return to managing the reality. Your senses are actually reporting. Rather than continuing to inhabit an assumption, your circumstances are comprehensively contradicting. Neville Goddard understood this mechanism with a precision that was genuinely ahead of his time. He described it not as a spiritual test of worthiness, but as a predictable feature of the neurological transformation process. He called it the feeling of the wish fulfilled meeting the facts of life, and he was specific about which one was real. The facts of life, as Neville used the phrase, are not the ultimate reality. They are the current outpicturing of the existing neural architecture. They are what the existing system projects onto the surface of physical experience to confirm its own continued authority. The wish fulfilled is the new architecture that is attempting to permanently displace the existing system. And when these two structures are in direct competition, the existing system uses the facts of life as its primary weapon against the wish fulfilled. What most people do when they encounter this weapon is exactly what the existing system needs them to do. They read the facts of life as authoritative feedback on whether the wish fulfilled is real. They perform what feels like rational and responsible evaluation of the evidence. The evidence says the manifestation is broken. The rational response to evidence that something is broken is to stop doing the broken thing and to reconsider the approach. This rational response is the precise mechanism by which the subconscious immune system defeats the new assumption. It does not defeat it through internal resistance alone. It defeats it by generating external evidence compelling enough to activate the rational mind's evidence processing protocols and then allowing the rational mind to do the work of withdrawing the assumption on the subconscious's behalf. This is why Neville's instruction to persist sounds unreasonable to the rational mind. The rational mind is operating exactly as it was designed to operate. It is processing available evidence and generating the most logically defensible response to that evidence. The problem is that the rational mind does not have access to the neurological layer where the actual competition between old and new architecture is taking place. It only has access to what the senses report, and what the senses are reporting during the final resistance period is not an accurate description of neurological reality. It is a description of what the losing system is projecting in its final attempt to avoid losing. The rational mind cannot tell the difference between genuine environmental feedback and manufactured evidence from a subconscious immune response because both categories of information arrive through the same sensory channels and carry the same surface-level characteristics of physical reality. Persisting through this period does not require ignoring the facts of life or pretending that the physical evidence does not exist. Neville was not prescribing denial. He was prescribing a specific neurological skill, the ability to process physical evidence without allowing it to update your core assumption about who you are and what your financial reality permanently is. This skill is extraordinarily rare because it requires operating two different processing systems simultaneously. The conscious rational mind receives the external data and processes it as information. The deeper neurological layer maintains the new financial architecture without treating the external data as authoritative feedback on whether that architecture is valid. Most people cannot do this because they have never needed to. The rational mind and the deeper neurological layer are not usually in conflict. They are usually processing the same environmental reality at different levels of abstraction, arriving at compatible conclusions and operating in coordination. The final resistance period forces a temporary decoupling of these two systems, requiring the rational mind to process circumstances. It finds compelling as evidence while the deeper layer maintains a state that the rational mind's evidence processing would normally override. The people who successfully navigate this period report that the decoupling has a specific quality that becomes recognizable once you know to look for it. The rational mind is fully engaged with the external evidence. It can articulate the arguments against the assumption with perfect coherence and apparent logical validity, but there is a layer underneath the rational processing where the arguments do not land with full biological authority. They are heard, they are understood, they are even found persuasive at the level of conscious analysis. But they do not update the core assumption. They arrive, and they are processed, and they are evaluated, and then they pass through without changing the fundamental neurological baseline that is quietly operating below the surface of the rational analysis. This is what Neville meant when he described knowing the end from the beginning, not certainty in the cognitive sense. A biological settledness that the rational arguments cannot reach because it is operating at a depth below where the rational arguments have jurisdiction. Before continuing to the second half of this discussion, your attention should go to the pinned comment below this video. What is there is directly relevant to the stage of this process being described, and if you are currently experiencing the specific kind of breakdown this video is about, what is in that comment addresses the practical dimension of navigating it. The most important practical question that emerges from this understanding is not philosophical, it is mechanical. Given that the final resistance period generates evidence that is physically real and rationally compelling, and given that the rational mind cannot reliably distinguish this evidence from genuine feedback about a process that is actually failing, what is the actual behavioral difference between someone who is in the final resistance period and someone who is genuinely pursuing an assumption that is not working and should be reconsidered? The answer is in the quality of the internal state, not in the content of the external circumstances. Someone in the final resistance period of a genuine neurological transformation experiences the external pressure as intense but increasingly hollow. The facts are present. The physical sensations are real. But the deepest layer of biological prediction about what the financial future permanently holds has already shifted away from the old architecture. The evidence lands. It is processed. But it does not fully convince at the level where conviction actually determines the direction of neurological change. There is a quality of watching a very loud argument being made by someone who no longer has the authority to enforce the conclusion they are arguing for. The argument is sophisticated, and the volume is high, and the evidence cited is real. But something underneath the rational processing already knows that the argument is the last gasp of a system that has already lost the structural battle, even if the physical world has not yet had time to reflect that loss. Someone who is pursuing an assumption that is not working at any genuine neurological depth experiences the external pressure differently. The doubt lands with full biological authority. The facts feel final. The heaviness of the circumstances points downward toward conclusion, rather than sideways toward transition. The rational arguments against continuing feel not only persuasive, but urgent and clarifying, as if the pressure is helpfully removing a delusion that was always going to end here. There is no layer underneath the rational processing that maintains a competing certainty. The circumstances and the core neurological prediction are aligned. They are saying the same thing. And what they are saying is that this particular financial identity is not yours, that the assumption was a form of wishful thinking rather than a genuine neurological installation, and that returning to baseline management of the existing reality is the appropriate and intelligent response. The distinction between these two internal experiences is not always obvious from inside them, especially during the peak intensity of the external pressure. But it is real and it is consequential, and learning to recognize it accurately is one of the most valuable skills that serious engagement with Neville's work actually develops. The training is uncomfortable, because it requires sitting inside the experience of the final resistance period long enough to feel its specific quality, which means tolerating the full intensity of the manufactured breakdown without immediately responding to it by either withdrawing the assumption or doubling down with forced emotional intensity. Both of those responses interrupt the process. Withdrawing the assumption feeds the old architecture exactly what it needs to maintain dominance. Forcing emotional intensity confirms the desired state as extraordinary rather than as baseline, which also feeds the old architecture by encoding the new state as anomalous rather than permanent. The response that actually completes the transformation is the most difficult response available. It is the response of continuing to inhabit the new state with the specific quality of bored and unremarkable certainty that characterizes genuine neurological possession of a desired reality. Not excitement about the new state, not gratitude for its anticipated arrival, the flat and uninterested relationship with it that your nervous system generates automatically toward anything it has fully classified as permanent and non-negotiable. This quality cannot be manufactured through willpower or positive thinking. It is the natural neurological output of an assumption that has achieved sufficient depth and consistency to begin genuinely competing with the old architecture for the position of dominant predictive baseline. You do not decide to feel bored certainty about your new financial state. The bored certainty arrives when the assumption has been maintained long enough and at sufficient neurological depth that the subconscious can no longer successfully argue that the new state is foreign. It has been present too long and too consistently to remain classified as intrusion. It has begun to be classified as home. The practical training for developing this capacity begins not during moments of external crisis, but during ordinary periods when the pressure is low enough that the rational mind is not fully mobilized against the new assumption. Neville prescribed a specific daily practice that most of his students understood only partially, and the part they typically missed was the most mechanically essential part of what he was actually prescribing. He called it sleeping in the end. Not visualizing the end before sleep, not reviewing a list of affirmations before sleep. Sleeping in the end. Occupying the neurological state of the desired reality as the baseline condition of your consciousness, at the moment when the conscious directing mind releases its authority and the automatic systems take over for the night. This is mechanically significant for a reason that has nothing to do with mysticism. The hypnagogic state, the threshold between waking and sleeping, is the period of lowest filtering activity in the entire cycle of human consciousness. The cognitive systems that normally evaluate incoming information against the existing baseline, comparing new data against the established predictive model and flagging inconsistencies for conscious attention, are withdrawing. The nervous system is transitioning from active threat assessment and environmental monitoring to the consolidated processing mode that occurs during sleep. In this transition, the architecture is more permeable than at any other accessible point. New structural information can be introduced with less resistance from the filtering systems that ordinarily protect the existing baseline from unauthorized update. What you bring into this state is not a visualization or a narrative or an emotional performance. It is a quality of bodily consciousness. The body of a person who already possesses extreme wealth has a different default physical state than the body of a person who is working to acquire it. The baseline muscle tension is different. The default breathing depth is different. The automatic relationship between the body and physical space is different. A person who grew up wealthy and has never known financial anxiety does not carry the specific physiological signature of someone who is monitoring for financial threat. The vigilance is absent because the threat that would generate the vigilance has never been part of their biological experience. Bringing this specific physical quality into the hypnagogic state, the body that is simply and unremarkably wealthy, rather than the body that is hopefully or anxiously pursuing wealth, is what Neville was actually prescribing when he said to sleep in the end. The overnight processing that occurs after entering this state does not produce dramatic or immediately visible changes. The subconscious does not announce its updates. It does not generate confirmatory feelings the following morning that clearly indicate something shifted during the night. The process is quiet and cumulative, and it operates below the threshold of conscious detection. What you notice over time, not the next day but over weeks of consistent practice, is a subtle shift in the automatic emotional weight your nervous system assigns to financial information. The data that previously generated immediate stress responses begins to carry slightly less automatic urgency. The gap between receiving financial information and generating a stress response becomes slightly larger. The gap is initially so small it is almost imperceptible, but the gap is the beginning of the new architecture, asserting itself against the automatic dominance of the old one. This gradual and almost imperceptible shift is what most people in manifestation communities never identify as evidence that the process is working, because it does not resemble the dramatic and emotionally satisfying confirmation they have been trained to look for. They are watching for sudden synchronicities, for unexpected money arriving from unfamiliar directions, for the universe delivering unmistakable signs that their assumption is being processed and fulfilled. What is actually happening during the period of genuine neurological installation is happening too quietly and too far below the surface of conscious experience to be detected as dramatic evidence of anything. The architecture is being rebuilt. The rebuilding generates no fanfare. It generates a slight and growing flatness in the emotional response to financial data, a mild and increasing sense that the financial anxiety which previously arrived automatically is arriving slightly less automatically, a quality of greater ease in occupying the new state that has nothing to do with forced positive thinking and everything to do with the genuine structural deepening of the new assumption at the neurological level where it actually matters. When the external resistance then arrives, when the subconscious immune system detects that the new architecture has achieved real depth and mobilizes its manufactured evidence in response, the person who has been building the new state through consistent and structurally genuine assumption work experiences it differently than the person who has been performing positive thinking at the surface level. The manufactured evidence is still physically real. The bills are still real bills. The pressure is still genuine pressure, but the new architecture has developed enough structural integrity that it does not immediately collapse under the weight of the manufactured evidence. It bends, it creates internal distress, it generates genuine discomfort and genuine cognitive conflict, but it does not break. And it does not break because it has been built at a depth where the manufactured evidence cannot reach it with full destructive force. Neville described this structural integrity as the armor of persistence. He was not describing psychological stubbornness or the refusal to process external information. He was describing the natural result of an assumption that has been consistently maintained at sufficient neurological depth to develop genuine structural resilience. The armor is not manufactured through willpower. It is the automatic property of a neural architecture that has been given enough time and enough consistent signal to develop the kind of structural depth that the subconscious immune system's manufactured evidence cannot fully penetrate. The armor arrives on its own when the assumption has been genuine and consistent enough. You do not put on the armor. You build it by continuing to inhabit the state long enough for the state to become structurally real at the level where the immune response is aimed. The question of how long this process takes is one that Neville refused to answer with any specificity. And the refusal was not evasion. It was accuracy. The timeline is entirely determined by the depth of the existing old architecture and the consistency and neurological sincerity of the new assumption work. A person who has spent 50 years building an extremely deep and extensively reinforced neural architecture, a financial limitation, requires more time and more consistent assumption work to achieve permanent neurological dominance of the new state than a person who has spent 20 years building a less extensive architecture. There is no universal timeline. There is only the relationship between the depth of what is being displaced and the consistency and depth of what is replacing it. What Neville was categorical about was not the timeline but the inevitability of the outcome, given genuine and consistent assumption work. He described it as a law rather than a tendency, because the relationship between neurological architecture and physical reality is not probabilistic from Neville's perspective. The external world does not sometimes reflect the internal state. It always reflects the internal state. The only question is whether the internal state has actually changed at the level where the reflection originates. Positive thinking that does not penetrate below the surface of conscious processing does not change the internal state at the level that determines the external reflection. Genuine assumption work that achieves neurological depth and consistency does change it. And when it changes at sufficient depth, the external world has no mechanism for sustaining a configuration that contradicts the new architecture. It must eventually reflect what the subconscious has permanently accepted as real. This is the fact that makes the final resistance period navigable once you understand it clearly. The manufactured breakdown your circumstances are presenting is not a report on what is permanently real. It is the existing system's most aggressive attempt to prevent a change that is already occurring at the level below the reach of manufactured evidence. The system is fighting because it is losing. The fighting is the proof of the losing, and persisting through the fighting without withdrawing the assumption is not an act of faith in an uncertain outcome. It is the mechanical completion of a neurological process that has already advanced past the point of return at the architectural level, even though the physical world has not yet had time to rearrange itself to reflect what the subconscious has already accepted. Neville summarized this entire understanding in a single sentence that most people read as spiritual encouragement and should read as neurological instruction. He said the feeling of the wish fulfilled is the anchor. The anchor is not a metaphor for optimism. The anchor is a precise description of function. When a ship is anchored, the anchor does not prevent the water from moving around the ship. It does not stop the wind from pushing against the hull. It does not eliminate the surface-level disturbance of weather and current. It maintains the position of the ship beneath the surface-level disturbance, at a depth where the surface conditions do not have sufficient force to move it. The feeling of the wish fulfilled is an anchor in exactly this sense. When it is genuinely installed at sufficient neurological depth, the surface disturbance of manufactured evidence and external pressure cannot move it. The surface is disturbed. The anchor holds. And when the storm of final resistance has exhausted itself, the ship is still exactly where the anchor kept it, positioned in the reality that the anchor was set for. Your manifestation feels broken right before it works, because the part of your neurology responsible for generating that feeling is spending the last of its available resources trying to move a ship that has already been anchored below the reach of what it has left to throw at it. The feeling is real. The breaking is not. What is actually happening beneath the feeling is the completion of a process that began the moment you introduced a genuine assumption about your financial identity that was deep enough and consistent enough to challenge the existing architecture at the level where permanent change actually takes place. The feeling of breaking is the sound of the old architecture exhausting itself. And when it finishes making that sound, what will remain in the silence is the new architecture, already in place, already operating as the dominant predictive baseline for your financial reality, waiting only for the physical world to complete its inevitable rearrangement into alignment with what your subconscious has permanently accepted as true. If you are in this period right now, the comment section below this video is the right place to say so. Write the word almost, because that is precisely where you are. Not failing, not broken, almost complete. The process is working. The feeling that it is not is the most reliable evidence available that it is. There is one more dimension of this process that Neville addressed directly, and that receives almost no serious attention in contemporary discussions of his work. He described the period after the internal resistance ceases, after the old architecture has exhausted its manufactured evidence and the new state has achieved undisputed neurological dominance, as a period that requires a specific and deliberate quality of consciousness that is different from what was required during the resistance period. During the resistance period, the primary requirement was persistence, the refusal to withdraw the assumption under pressure. After the resistance ceases, the primary requirement shifts to what Neville called occupying the state with authority. The distinction is subtle but mechanically important. Persistence is the maintenance of an assumption against active opposition. Occupying with authority is the inhabitation of a state that has already won the internal competition and is now simply waiting for the physical world to catch up. These require different internal orientations. Persistence has a quality of active maintenance, of holding something in place against the force that is trying to move it. Occupying with authority has the quality of simply being somewhere that is already yours, without the need to hold it in place because nothing is trying to move you out of it anymore. The fighting is over. What remains is the unremarkable and permanent inhabitation of a reality that the subconscious has already accepted as home. Most people who reach this point after a long and difficult resistance period make a subtle error that extends the interval between neurological completion and physical manifestation unnecessarily. Having been in the active mode of persistence for so long, they continue operating with the internal orientation of someone who is holding something against opposition even after the opposition has ceased. They continue checking whether the assumption is holding. They continue monitoring the external environment for evidence of progress. They continue generating the internal posture of active maintenance, even though the thing being maintained no longer requires active maintenance to remain in place. This continued posture communicates to the subconscious that the new state is still being held rather than simply inhabited, which slightly delays the full reclassification of the new state from chosen assumption to permanent biological baseline. The transition from persistence to authority is not something you decide to make. It is something you recognize when it arrives. The fighting stops, and you notice that you are not fighting anymore, and you allow the not fighting to simply be the new condition without immediately replacing it with a new form of anxious maintenance. You let the state be unremarkably yours in exactly the way that your own name is unremarkably yours. No maintenance required, no monitoring required, no checking whether it is still there. It is there because it is you, and you do not check whether you are still yourself between moments of conscious attention. This is the final stage of what Neville taught, and it is the stage that the manifestation industry almost never reaches in its descriptions of how the process actually completes. The completion is not dramatic. It is not announced. It arrives as a quality of quiet that follows the noise of the resistance period, and in that quiet the new financial reality is simply present as a neurological fact, waiting with complete patience for the physical world to finish rearranging itself into the configuration that accurately reflects what the subconscious already knows to be permanently true.